If you were a factory worker in Essen or Hamburg in 1944, your life was governed by the siren. It was a sound that tore through the air, signaling that the work had to stop. The assembly lines for the Panzer IVs would halt, the welders would drop their torches, and thousands of men and forced laborers would scramble into the damp concrete dark of the bunkers. Production didn't just slow down, it ceased. The rhythm of German industry was a broken, stuttering heartbeat, constantly interrupted by the terrifying roar of the 8th Air Force by day and the RAF by night. Every bearing ball, every synthetic rubber tire, and every gallon of aviation fuel produced was a miracle of survival, dragged out of the rubble. Now, cast your mind across the Atlantic to that same hour. In Willow Run, Michigan, just outside Detroit, the air didn't scream with sirens, it hummed. It was a low, constant vibration that you could feel through the soles of your shoes. This was the Ford Bomber Plant, a facility so vast that it had its own weather patterns inside the main hangar. Here, the lights never went out. There were no blackout curtains. There was no fear. The B-24 Liberators rolled off the line not in fits and starts, but in a relentless, unbroken stream, one heavy bomber every 63 minutes. For the German High Command and for the average German soldier on the front lines, this reality was almost impossible to conceptualize. They knew America was large, they knew it was rich, but they could not fathom a war where the factories never stopped. To a German populace living in cellars, the idea of an industrial continent operating at 100% capacity 24 hours a day without a single pane of glass being shattered by a bomb sounded like science fiction. There is a famous story, often retold by veterans, of a captured German major in North Africa. He was watching the Americans unload supplies at a captured port. He saw tanks, jeeps, and crates of ammunition being lowered by cranes. But what broke him wasn't the weaponry. It was a chocolate cake. He saw a fresh chocolate cake arrived from the States, still in its tin. He realized then that if the enemy had the logistical capacity to ship dessert across an ocean, the war was already lost. That cake represented the terrifying luxury of the American home front: safety. While Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and minister of armaments, was performing miracles to disperse German industry into caves and forests to hide from the bombers, American industry was centralizing, growing bigger, brighter, and louder. In Richmond, California, the Kaiser shipyards were turning the complex art of shipbuilding into a simple assembly task. They were building Liberty ships, massive cargo vessels, in days, not months. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was launched 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel was laid. Imagine the psychological impact of that statistic on a German U-boat commander. He is hunting in the freezing Atlantic, risking his life to sink one merchant ship, and in the time it takes him to return to port, rearm, and deploy again, the Americans have built 20 more ships to replace the one he sank. It was a mathematical hopelessness. The Americans weren't just winning the war, they were flooding it. This disconnect between the two realities came to a head when German prisoners of war began to arrive in the United States. This is one of the most overlooked psychological turning points of the conflict. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, men who had been told by Goebbels' propaganda that New York was in flames and that American industry was collapsing, were put on trains and transported inland to camps in Mississippi, Texas, and the Midwest. Their journey was a revelation. They pressed their faces against the train windows, expecting to see scars. They looked for the craters, the ruined bridges, the anti-aircraft batteries ringing the cities. Instead, they saw neon signs. They saw cars, civilian cars, driving on paved highways with their headlights on. They saw fields of corn and wheat that stretched to the horizon, untouched by tank treads. They saw cities like Chicago and St. Louis glowing on the horizon, lit up like jewels. For many of these men, the shock was total. One German POW recorded in his diary that he felt a deep, sinking betrayal. He realized that while his family in Berlin was boiling wallpaper to find starch to eat, Americans were complaining about gas rationing that limited their Sunday drives. They saw the sheer, unmolested scale of the enemy. They realized that the tanks they had fought in Normandy or Italy weren't the last desperate reserves of a dying nation. They were just the overflow. The lack of interruption in U.S. factories meant that American engineers could focus on efficiency rather than survival. In Germany, a tank factory might have to change its supply route 3 times a week because rail lines were bombed. They had to use inferior steel because the Swedish shipments were cut off. They had to simplify designs, not because it was better, but because they lacked the rare metals for complex alloys. In contrast, American factories focused on what is called process engineering. Because they didn't have to worry about the roof blowing off, they could perfect the line. They could waste material. If a stamped part wasn't perfect, it was tossed in the scrap bin to be melted down. In Germany, that part would be hand-filed until it fit, because they couldn't afford to waste the metal. This difference created a disparity in liability. An American Sherman tank might not have been as heavy or as lethal as a German Tiger, but it worked. It started when you turned the key. And if the transmission blew, you didn't repair it. You walked to the supply depot, where 1,000 crates of new transmissions were stacked to the ceiling, and you put in a new one. This disposable mindset was alien to the Europeans. The ability to treat airplanes, trucks, and tanks as consumable items like bullets was a luxury purchased by the safety of the American continent. There was also the human element. The American worker was well fed. They ate meat, they drank coffee, and they slept in beds in quiet neighborhoods. A rested, fed workforce operating in a well-lit, heated factory is infinitely more productive than a slave laborer shivering in a damp tunnel in the Harz Mountains. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just about steel, it was about calories and sleep. When the Allies finally crossed into Germany in 1945, the soldiers saw the other side of this coin. They found the underground factories, like the Mittelwerk, where the V2 rockets were built. They saw the desperation of a nation trying to build spaceships in caves while their world burned above them. It was a technological marvel, yes, but it was the marvel of a trapped animal. The German commanders eventually understood that they hadn't been defeated by superior courage or even superior tactics, but by the relentless, uninterrupted hum of a factory 4,000 miles away. They were defeated by the shift whistle that blew at 5 p.m., signaling a shift change, not an air raid. They were defeated by the lights of Broadway that never went dark. In the end, the most powerful weapon of the Second World War wasn't the atomic bomb, or the Tiger tank, or the Spitfire. It was the American assembly line. It was the ability to make a mistake and then make 10,000 replacements for that mistake before the enemy could reload. The Germans fought a war of moments, of tactical brilliance and desperate defense. The Americans fought a war of logistics, a war where the factory floor was the true front line, and that front line was untouchable. When the surrender was finally signed and the silence fell over Europe, it was a silence that had reigned in German factories for months. But across the ocean, the hammers were still falling, the rivets were still being driven, and the furnaces were still burning. The giant had not even broken a sweat.